The sun was just beginning to rise as she walked into the luxury car dealership, her old sandals making soft clicks against the polished floor. She wasn't dressed fancy, just a simple, faded dress and a bag that had seen better days. The salesmen in their crisp suits glanced at her, then quickly looked away, as if she were invisible. She had saved for years, scraping together every penny, dreaming of buying a decent car, nothing flashy, just something reliable. But the moment she stepped in, the air changed. The manager, a tall man with a sharp suit and an even sharper smirk, barely acknowledged her. When she asked to see a modest sedan, he chuckled, nodding toward the cheapest car in the corner. "That one's on sale," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Might still be a stretch for you." Her face burned, but she kept her voice steady. "I'd like to test drive it, please." The manager sighed, as if she were wasting his time. He tossed the keys to a junior salesman, a younger guy who at least had the decency to look embarrassed. As she drove, she could feel their eyes on her through the showroom windows, whispering, laughing. When she returned, she asked about financing options. The manager barely glanced at her documents before pushing them back. "I don't think you qualify," he said flatly. "Maybe try a used lot across town." She left with her head held high, but inside, her heart was heavy. She had worked hard, sacrificed so much, only to be treated like she didn't belong. Little did they know, the next day would change everything. She walked out of the dealership, the summer heat pressing down on her like a weight. The sting of humiliation still burned in her chest, but she refused to let it show. She had faced worse in life, this was just another challenge. As she waited at the bus stop, an old man sat beside her, his clothes just as worn as hers. He glanced at her, then at the dealership behind them, and shook his head. "They treat people like dirt in there," he muttered. "Act like they own the world just 'cause they sell fancy cars." She gave him a small, tired smile. "Some people forget what it's like to struggle." The old man studied her for a moment, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a faded business card. "My nephew works at a smaller dealership a few miles from here. Good people. They'll treat you right." She took the card, gratitude warming her voice. "Thank you." The bus arrived, and she climbed on, her mind already shifting to the next step. She wasn't giving up. That evening, she sat at her small kitchen table, counting her savings again. It wasn't much, but it was honest money, every dollar earned through hard work. She thought about the manager's smirk, the way he had dismissed her without even trying to help. Her phone buzzed, a message from her younger brother, who was working late at the factory. "Did you get the car?" She hesitated, then typed back, "Not yet. But I will." The next morning, she woke up early, determined. She dressed neatly, put on her only pair of good shoes, and took the bus to the dealership the old man had mentioned. This place was smaller, less flashy, but the moment she walked in, a salesman greeted her with a genuine smile. "Good morning. How can I help you today?" No judgment. No condescension. Just kindness. She explained what she was looking for, and he listened, really listened. When she mentioned her budget, he didn't laugh or dismiss her. Instead, he nodded. "Let's see what we can do." For the first time in a long while, she felt hope. Meanwhile, back at the luxury dealership, the manager was in his office, bragging to his team about how he had saved them from wasting time on a broke customer. They all laughed, clueless about what was coming. Because at that very moment, a sleek black Rolls-Royce was pulling into the city, and inside it sat a man who was about to turn everything upside down. The smaller dealership was a breath of fresh air. The salesman, a middle-aged man with calloused hands and warm eyes, showed her several used cars within her budget, each one inspected, clean, and honestly priced. No pressure, no sneers. Just patience. As she test drove a modest but well-maintained sedan, she allowed herself to imagine it, finally owning a car that could get her to work without breaking down, something reliable enough to visit her brother on weekends. Back in the showroom, the salesman crunched the numbers. With your down payment, the monthly installments would be tight but manageable, he said. And we can throw in a free first service. She exhaled, relief washing over her. I think this might work. Just as she was about to sign the papers, her phone rang. An unknown number. Meanwhile, the black Rolls-Royce glided through the city streets, turning heads at every intersection. Inside, the billionaire, a self-made man who had once slept on park benches, scrolled through a report on his tablet. His assistant, seated across from him, cleared his throat. Sir, we've located her. She's at a dealership on the other side of town. The billionaire's jaw tightened. Good. Let's go. Back at the luxury dealership, the manager was sipping coffee, smug as ever, when the showroom doors burst open. A young salesman rushed in, face pale. Boss, you need to see this. Outside, the Rolls-Royce had pulled up, its polished chrome gleaming under the sun. The manager nearly choked on his coffee. Billionaires didn't just show up unannounced. He scrambled outside, adjusting his tie, already rehearsing his pitch. But the billionaire ignored him, scanning the lot with a cold stare. Where is she? The manager blinked. I'm sorry, sir. The woman who came in yesterday. Dressed simply, asked about a sedan. You humiliated her. Silence. The manager's blood ran cold. How did this man know? The billionaire's voice dropped to a dangerous calm. You judged her by her clothes instead of her character. That's a mistake I don't tolerate. Before the manager could stammer a reply, the billionaire turned to his assistant. Call the other dealership. Tell them I'm covering her car, in full. And then, he added, locking eyes with the manager, cancel every corporate account we have with this place. At the smaller dealership, she stood frozen, phone pressed to her ear as the billionaire's assistant explained the situation. Her knees nearly buckled. Wait, what? Who is this? The salesman, overhearing, gaped at her. Ma'am. I think you just got your car paid for. By him. She stared at the keys in her hand, her mind spinning. None of this made sense. But it was about to. The salesman at the small dealership kept staring at her like she'd grown a second head. You really don't know who that was on the phone? He asked, voice hushed with disbelief. She shook her head slowly, the keys to her new car feeling suddenly heavy in her palm. I've never met any billionaires in my life. Outside, the roar of an approaching engine cut through their conversation. Through the showroom windows, they saw the black Rolls-Royce pull up, its tinted windows hiding the occupant from view. Her stomach dropped. That's for me? The salesman swallowed hard. I think you're about to find out. At the luxury dealership, panic had set in. The manager paced his office, phone pressed to his ear as he desperately tried to call corporate headquarters. No, you don't understand, he's pulling all our contracts. We're talking millions. Outside, salesmen clustered in nervous groups, watching as the billionaire's assistant made call after call, systematically dismantling their business connections. One junior salesman, the same one who had reluctantly helped with her test drive the day before, quietly gathered his things. I'm out, he muttered. This place was always toxic anyway. The door chime rang as the billionaire entered the small dealership. He was taller in person, his sharp suit looking like it cost more than her yearly rent, but what struck her most were his eyes, dark, intense, and oddly familiar. You, he said quietly, looking straight at her. I've been looking for you for 20 years. Her breath caught. I don't understand. The billionaire reached into his pocket and pulled out a faded photograph. The edges were worn, the colors bleached with time, but the image was clear, a teenage boy and girl standing outside a homeless shelter, arms around each other, smiling despite their tattered clothes. Her hand flew to her mouth. "No. It can't be. You saved my life that winter," he said, voice thick with emotion. "You gave me your last blanket when the shelter ran out. You shared your food when I hadn't eaten in days." He gestured to the car keys in her hand. This is nothing compared to what you did for me." Memories flooded back, the brutal winter, the crowded shelter, the scared boy who'd shown up with nothing but the clothes on his back. She'd been just a kid herself, but she'd shared what little she had. Tears welled in her eyes. You were that quiet boy from the South Side shelter." He nodded, a rare smile breaking through his usual stern expression. "And today, I finally get to repay my debt." Back at the luxury dealership, the manager was still screaming into his phone when the first corporate cancellation email arrived. Then another. And another. By the time the fifth cancellation hit his inbox, his knees gave out, and he collapsed into his leather chair. It was over. The small dealership had gone completely silent. Even the mechanics in the back had stopped working, peering through the garage door at the unbelievable scene unfolding in the showroom. She stared at the photograph, her fingers trembling as they traced the edges. "All these years. I never thought." Her voice broke. That winter at the shelter had been one of the hardest times of her life, yet she'd never forgotten the quiet boy who disappeared one morning without a word. The billionaire, no, the boy she'd once shared her last meal with, cleared his throat. "When I left the shelter, I promised myself two things." He held up one finger. "First, that I'd never be helpless again." A second finger joined the first. "And second, that I'd find you one day." A tear slipped down her cheek. "But how did you even recognize me?" He smiled, the expression softening his usually stern features. "Your eyes. They're exactly the same, kind even when you have every reason not to be." Outside, a crowd had begun gathering around the Rolls-Royce. People snapped photos with their phones, whispering excitedly. The billionaire's assistant discreetly motioned for privacy, and the dealership staff quickly ushered everyone inside, closing the blinds. The salesman who had helped her earlier rubbed his neck awkwardly. "So, about your car paperwork." The billionaire waved a hand. "Have your manager send the bill directly to my office. And," he added, glancing at the modest sedan she'd chosen, "we'll be taking that one today." She blinked. "Wait, you're not giving me some fancy car?" He laughed, a rich, warm sound. "Would you even accept it? I remember how stubborn you were about sharing that last sandwich. You only gave in when I promised to pay you back double someday." A surprised laugh burst from her lips. The memory was so vivid, his serious teenage face bargaining with her over half a stale sandwich. "So this is you paying me back double, then?" "Not even close," he said quietly. "This is just the beginning." Meanwhile, word had reached the luxury dealership about what was happening across town. The junior salesman who had quit earlier stood outside, watching the commotion from a distance. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number. "Hey, it's me," he said when the call connected. "Remember that woman I told you about yesterday? You're not going to believe what's happening now." Back at the small dealership, she walked slowly around her new, paid-in-full, car, still processing everything. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll let me buy you lunch," the billionaire said. "There's a lot more we need to talk about." Something in his tone made her pause. "What is it?" He hesitated, then pulled out another photograph, this one more recent, showing a group of teenagers standing outside what looked like a community center. "Do you remember Maria? From the shelter?" Her breath caught. "Little Maria? With the braids?" He nodded. "She runs a non-profit now. Helps homeless kids get into schools." His eyes held hers. "We've been working together for years. And we've been looking for you almost as long." The room seemed to spin around her. All this time, she'd thought those shelter connections were lost forever. That the people from that dark time had scattered to the winds. But they'd been searching for her, remembering her. The billionaire extended his hand. "Come to lunch. Let me introduce you to some old friends." For the first time in years, she felt something she'd almost forgotten, the warmth of belonging. The diner was nothing fancy, just a small neighborhood place with cracked vinyl booths and the smell of strong coffee hanging in the air. Exactly the kind of place she usually went to, and she found herself oddly touched that he'd chosen it instead of some five-star restaurant. As they slid into a corner booth, the billionaire, she still couldn't think of him as anything else, despite now knowing his name was Daniel, smiled at her bewildered expression. "What? You thought I'd forgotten how much you loved greasy spoon diners?" She blinked. "You remember that? Best pancakes I ever had were at that truck stop you dragged me to," he said, pouring sugar into his coffee. 3 days without eating, and you spent your last $5 splitting an order with me." The memory came rushing back, his hollow cheeks, the way his hands had shaken as he tried not to wolf the food down too fast. She'd lied and said she wasn't hungry so he'd take the bigger half. Before she could respond, the diner door jingled open. A woman in her late 30s burst in, her curly hair pulled into a messy bun, eyes scanning the room until they landed on their booth. "Maria," she whispered, barely recognizing the confident woman where a scrawny teenager had once been. Maria's face broke into a radiant smile. "Took you long enough to turn up." In 2 strides, she had her wrapped in a crushing hug that smelled faintly of lavender and pencil shavings. "Do you have any idea how many shelters we've called looking for you?" Over Maria's shoulder, she saw Daniel smiling quietly, letting them have this moment. The stories came pouring out over plates of eggs and toast. Maria had gone to college on scholarships, eventually starting a non-profit that provided school supplies and tutoring for homeless kids. "We've got 7 centers now," she said proudly, passing over a worn business card. Daniel had taken a different path, working construction by day, studying business at night. His first company had been a failure. His second had changed everything. "But I never forgot where I came from," he said quietly, stirring his coffee. "Or who helped me survive it." She listened, heart swelling as they told her about the network they'd built, shelter alumni who helped each other find jobs, donated to Maria centers, even just met up for coffee sometimes to remember where they'd started. "And now," Maria said, reaching across the table to squeeze her hand, "you're part of it again." Meanwhile, across town, the fallout from the luxury dealership scandal was spreading. News crews had picked up the story, and the viral video of Daniel canceling contracts was being shared thousands of times. The manager sat in his now empty showroom, fielding angry calls from corporate. The junior salesman who'd quit earlier watched from his new job interview across the street, smirking as another news van pulled up. "Karma's a bitch," he muttered, straightening his tie before walking into the interview, at Maria's nonprofit, as it turned out. Back at the diner, she hesitated before asking the question that had been burning in her chest. "Why now? After all these years?" Daniel and Maria exchanged a look. "We've actually been close to finding you a few times," Maria admitted. "But you moved a lot, changed numbers." Daniel leaned forward. "Then yesterday, one of my junior executives was buying a car at that dealership and witnessed what happened. He texted me the description, said there was this woman being treated like dirt, but she held her head high in a way that reminded him of." He trailed off, smiling. "Of me," she finished, incredulous. "Of us," Maria corrected gently. "That stubborn pride we all had to develop to survive." The check came, and Daniel reached for it, but she snatched it first. "Nope. My turn." She grinned at their surprised faces. "What? I've got a paid-off car now. I can afford diner food." As they stepped out into the afternoon sun, Maria linked arms with her. "So, when can you start volunteering at the center?" We've got a new batch of kids who need to hear your story." For the first time in decades, she felt something slot into place inside her chest, like a missing piece finally found. The community center buzzed with activity as she pushed open the glass doors the following Saturday. Teenagers milled about, some studying at long tables, others laughing over board games in the corner. The smell of fresh popcorn mixed with the citrusy cleaner they used on the floors. Maria waved from across the room where she was helping a girl with braids wrestle a jammed printer. "You came." She held up the box of donated books she'd spent all week collecting from neighborhood drives. "Wouldn't miss it." A lanky boy eyed her skeptically from one of the study tables. "You're the lady from the news? The one who got the billionaire to wreck that dealership?" Heat rose to her cheeks. Apparently, the story had spread further than she realized. "I didn't, it wasn't like that. We just knew each other a long time ago." The boy, Jason, she'd learn, shrugged. "Still cool." Daniel showed up an hour later, carrying 2 massive pizzas and trailed by a camera crew. Maria groaned. "Not this again." He held up his free hand in surrender. "Documentary team, not news. They're covering the Shelter Alumni Network." She hung back as the cameras rolled, capturing Daniel kneeling beside a wheelchair to help a tiny girl with her math homework. This was a side of him she hadn't seen, patient, gentle, completely at ease despite his expensive suit in a room full of battered textbooks and second-hand furniture. During a lull, he found her reorganizing the donated clothes closet. "Not what you expected?" She folded a sweater with careful hands. "I think I'm still catching up." A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the distant sound of Maria scolding someone for putting salt in the sugar jar. Meanwhile, the luxury dealership's downfall had become a cautionary tale. News outlets ran segments on "the death of customer service," using security footage of that fateful day. The manager had been fired, the location slated for closure. In a twist no one expected, the junior salesman who'd quit, Mark, had not only gotten the job at Maria's nonprofit but was now spearheading a program to help displaced dealership employees retrain for other careers. "Funny how things work out," he said when she ran into him at the supply closet. She handed him a box of pencils. "You were decent to me that day. That counts for something." As the weeks passed, she fell into a rhythm, mornings at her old job, afternoons tutoring at the center, weekends helping Maria expand their outreach. Daniel popped in when he could, though his schedule was insane. One rainy Thursday, she stayed late to help Jason with his college applications. When they finally finished, the downpour had turned torrential. "Need a ride?" Daniel's voice came from the doorway, holding an umbrella. Jason smirked. "You know he's got, like, 5 cars, right?" She flicked a pencil at him. "Mind your business." The Rolls-Royce was idling out front, but Daniel surprised her by pressing keys into her hand, to the modest sedan he'd bought her weeks ago, parked right behind his luxury vehicle. "Thought you might want your own wheels tonight," he said casually. Something about the gesture, respecting her independence even when he could have easily played the hero, made her throat tighten. As she drove home through the rain, windshield wipers keeping time with some old song on the radio, it hit her. She was happy. Truly, deeply happy. 6 months later, the grand reopening of the former luxury dealership drew crowds. But the gleaming sign now read, "Second Chance Auto, a worker-owned cooperative specializing in affordable used cars." She stood beside Daniel and Maria at the ribbon cutting, wearing not a designer dress but her usual simple clothes, though with a new confidence in her posture. Reporters shouted questions about her "rags to riches" story, but she stepped up to the microphone and surprised everyone. "This isn't about me getting revenge or becoming rich," she said, voice steady. "It's about what happens when we stop judging people by their appearances." Behind her, the new staff, mostly former employees from the old dealership who'd retrained through Mark's program, applauded. The once arrogant manager was notably absent. The real celebration happened later at the community center, where folding chairs and potluck dishes covered every surface. Jason, now accepted to trade school, proudly showed off his scholarship letter to anyone who'd look. Maria's latest group of teens performed an admittedly terrible but enthusiastic rap about algebra. Daniel appeared at her side with 2 paper plates overloaded with casseroles. "You know," he said through a mouthful of potatoes, "none of this would have happened if you hadn't been kind to a starving kid 20 years ago." She nudged him with her elbow. "And if some billionaire hadn't made a dramatic entrance at a car dealership." They laughed, the sound blending with the joyful chaos around them. Later that night, as she drove home in her trusty sedan, now with a Second Chance Auto license plate frame, she passed the old shelter where they'd all met. It was still there, still helping people. She pulled over and sat for a moment, watching a tired-looking woman shepherd 3 kids inside. Without thinking, she reached for the box of granola bars she kept in her glove compartment, a habit from her own hungry years, and walked across the street. "Here," she said, offering the snacks to the wide-eyed children. "It gets better." The mother's exhausted eyes flickered with something like hope. And just like that, the circle continued.